On the Minorcan Mullet report today for October the 27th, 2021, we're going to have the U.S. Coast Guard and the Altamaha Riverkeepers with a discussion of the current state of affairs of the project and what's to be expected, along with a little question and answer period.
All right, thank you, Maggie. I think when I stop talking we're probably just going to have to say timeout. So my goal for today is to answer your questions. So I'm going to give a brief update on some of the core areas that are, sort of obvious of what we're still doing, because, I've heard a lot of talk of celebration, and that's great. But the main point is that we're not done yet. There's sometimes, when you're at the very end, and it's the things that you can't see that you want to make sure that you take care of the most. And so that's something that I'm still here. And then when I leave, Tyler Jones, who is, he's a member of your community as well as being your public information officer for the Coastal Resources Division, our job is to keep you informed. And if we're not doing our job, you reach out to us, you reach out to Maggie. That's what she's there for as well. So, it's creating this line of communication so that your questions, your concerns, what you're seeing, which is incredibly valuable, can get addressed. And sometimes we'll have an answer for something. Sometimes it's still an unknown, and it's our job to also tell you, hey, it's something that we don't know yet, and we're working on that. A little background on me. What I'm not a scientist. I am not a salvage engineer. I am not an oil expert. So my job has been to learn from all of those folks and to distill that information. So at any point, if there are questions that I can't answer, I will get those questions to the organizers so that they can distribute that information out. So what I do is I do a little bit of everything, a jack of all trades. So I've been with our salvage folks, I've been with our shoreline response team, our on-water response team, I've been with our air operations branch, I've been over at our decontamination site where they sort debris, as well as basically whatever the response calls for. And if you've been to our website, most of that imagery is shot either by me or by the helo. So I kind of consider myself as a member of the community that is at least allowed to get pretty close. And so it's those same questions that I encourage you all to ask of me are the same questions that I've asked our experts, and the burden of delivering the information. And like I said, I'm here to deliver that information to you. So just curious, did everyone get a chance to watch the media brief yesterday? I think Andy said he had some trouble with watching it, but okay, so I'll do my best to give a quick rundown on the sequence of events of what's going to happen next. So right out in the middle of the sound, what we've been calling the wreck site, or the environmental protection barrier, our next stage is to clear out the debris that has accumulated where the sections of the ship, most notably the last two sections of the ship that came up without the bottom, or the side of the ship. The goal is to, I shouldn't say the goal. The job is to remove the debris that is on top of that, mostly vehicles, as well as the sides of the ship that are still down there. So the way to think about it is, when they were lifting, the bottom stayed, and what came up, came up. More came up with the last section than the previous section, but our hydrographic surveys have shown, since Section 5 came up, a considerable pile of debris there. And our most recent hydrographic survey, which is a side survey, so it's not as detailed as the survey that they will do once the VB 10,000 departs, reveals that there's less debris where 4 was, but that could change depending on the quality of the surveys that they will do once the VB 10,000 is effectively out of the way. So once they clear out the debris, the next goal will be to start the deconstruction of the barrier and the removal of the scour protection. Right now, the sequence of those events are the hard boom and the netting will come out. Now, this is after the debris has been cleared, right? The hard boom and the netting comes out, and then they'll work on the pilings, And then as of right now, the last parts to go will be the scour containers and the concrete mats. Since those were put in before the barrier was established, they'll deal with those after they get the EPB cleaned up. Now all these plans are fluid, so depending on when they start to get down there, after they clean out the barrier, they'll also get a closer look at the scour protection with those surveys. And if there's any concerns that the scour protection might have to come out before a pipe or a net gets removed, then they'll address that. And so that's part of the sort of the thread line throughout the entire removal process has been to adapt and modify plans. And that process will continue until the entire infrastructure is removed. So what I say today might be different 2 or 3 weeks from now, depending on when we get to those stages. That is the wreck site. So how long is that going to take? The debris cleanup, once the VB's out of here, which the VB departure is imminent, it's the next couple days. I mean, they're working right now to sea fasten and prepare that, that vessel to depart. The debris removal should take about a couple weeks. They're going to be using grabs, so it's if you look at the wreck removal as being high tech, very high engineering intensive, the equipment that they're going to use to remove the debris, which has sonar mounted on the top of it to be able to make sure it's going to the proper piles, that will go relatively quickly. And a good corollary would be any time that we've done debris removal earlier, I would say around the halfway point we were doing some debris removal. Those operations typically are measured in days rather than weeks and months for removing a section. So I would expect the same to happen for the debris that's out there. And then the final dismantling of the entire protection barrier, according to to TNT's project management chart, is about 35 days, starting with the final lift. So we're already inside that kind of last month and a half. So I'd say, if you could look at the EPB as being gone sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas, more toward Thanksgiving. That's the wreck site. So it's going to get clear a lot sooner than it took us to remove the wreck. As far as 615 Bay Street, so while I don't know exactly how long the partial dismantling process will go. What we do know is that at Mars, it would typically take around a month and a half to 2 months to fully dismantle a section. So the goal at the 615 Bay Street site is to take the 2 sections of the ship, cut them down into smaller pieces using the crane called the Thor, to move those sections onto a barge or a series of barges to ship them out. So potentially that process could take less time than a full dismantling at Mars. But once again, it all depends on how the process evolves. That it will happen simultaneously. So there's nothing that's happening here that is independent, meaning that the equipment they're using to break down the sections is independent of the equipment that we're using to remove debris and remove the barrier, what we would call simultaneous operations. And that brings me to the third simultaneous operation, which has been going on since the day that the Golden Ray capsized, which is shoreline assessments, shoreline cleanup. So what we are preparing for is mostly debris. The concern about oil releases from the debris that's down there, especially considering that it's been submerged. Anything that's down there has been underwater for 2 years. The concern for any oil coming out is minimal because it would have already come out by now. And you'll see over the next couple days, the inflatable boom that was around the environmental protection barrier is in the process of being removed. The remainder of what we call our GRS boom, or our geographic response strategy sites, that's the protective bright orange boom that you might have seen around, the last of that boom has been removed. So, and that's all in response to based on what kind of threat that we're dealing with, which is floating debris, and our footprint on the water of being able to pick up debris has proven to be very effective, and the concern is minimal for for the need to keep that boom out there. The thing to remember is anything that's out there in the environment is also is going to continue to get beat on. So when the response starts to scale down, we're always looking to have the appropriate posture for what we are looking at. So if it's debris, it's okay, we have the right resources in place. And that takes me to the shoreline. So our shoreline teams will continue to walk the 200 miles of response monitored shoreline, looking predominantly for debris, as well as continuing to make assessments for previously oiled areas. Right? The endpoints for those sections are as follows. After a 2-month inspection process, as long as a section, which is a 500-meter segment of 200 miles of shoreline, which according to the math, that's about 600 segments. So 600 of these segments will go through a 2-month inspection process where they have to produce less than 3 1 centimeter or greater surface residual balls, tar balls, per 100 meters, and less than 1 3 centimeter tar ball per an entire segment. So when a segment or a stretch of shoreline produces less than that, it's marked as being potentially inactive. And then they'll look at that for 2 months to make sure that it stays that way. At any time, a segment can reactivate when there is a presence of oil there. So that's why the longest part of this response is going to be shoreline assessments and shoreline inspections. So whereas the EPB is most likely we're measuring it in weeks, those sections in months, the shoreline sections could take several months, well into next year. So the Unified Command will still have a presence in the shoreline team, meaning that the Coast Guard, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and the responsible party conduct the inspections, and that's per federal and state guidelines on shoreline cleanup and assessment technique. So that gives you an idea of the timeline and how there's, depending on what we're looking at, and all of these things are going on simultaneously. So you'll just start to see things slowly get closed out, and just know that the shoreline, which is the most important thing, that's the operation that will take the longest and has that level of thorough analysis through that. So other than that, if you've got any questions, I'd like to really take the majority of this time to go into your questions. And if I don't have the answer, I'm writing it down and I'll get the answer to you. Well, according to the Coastal Resources Division and the Georgia Department of Health, seafood has been safe since essentially the beginning of the response. I did remember getting some calls very early on about concern about oyster beds, and Tyler Jones just made sure he told me that the recreational oyster shellfish areas are in a different feeder of the estuary, meaning it's a different tidal area. So like I think it's not Joyner Creek. I forget the name of the shellfish picking area, but it's essentially been sheltered from any oil impacts the entire time. Now, as far as shellfish, seafood in St.Simons Sound, our fish meat surveys have not revealed any impacts. If there's a concern, please or if anyone catches fish or catches crab that you think has oil in it, bring it to the Coastal Resources Division, because they are the subject matter experts on that. And so, I'm Doug Heyman he's speaking through me. He's like, if you think you see anything that you catch, please bring it to us. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay.
Mike,
yes.
could you repeat the question in case,
Oh yes. So, not going to repeat the answer, but the question was, is the seafood safe to eat? Yes, Andy.
Do you have an idea of how many cars are down in the water right now?
No.
Is there an idea you guys have been able to kick around anything?
No, we were literally talking about that this morning, And so we're going off of our surveys, but the survey shows volume, but it's very difficult to see that. And because of all of the different places, and like there are still some sections that, you know, they're moving the cars over here and over there. So it's really, we're still compiling those numbers. And so our posture is always that, you know, what we see out there via the instruments that we use to survey the area, like we're looking at that. We're not necessarily saying, well, there's only X amount of cars, so we're only going to do this. So it's very, very difficult to know exactly how many are still down there because we don't have a final count on how many have been removed out of the sections that have already been discharged.
Do you think that the possibility of once the BB's been moved, that any of that underwater imagery might be available to the public so we can kind of take a look at what's available?
I'm working on that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep. Especially with the VB there, and there won't be any, most of the hydrographic surveys, there's this kind of, it can be more confusing because you're like, what's this blank spot right here? And you know, well, that was this barge and that was, so the next round of surveys, I'm working on getting that, like when we released the LiDAR imagery of the cars, I think way back in the beginning, once we had that imagery available, we made sure that we got it out. So once I have the surveys that they're going to use for the debris removal, once I have those, I'll be pushing to get that released.
What's involved in pulling those pilings up?
So it's two methods. The primary method is essentially vibration. You wiggle it with the Pacific crane. So pull it up, and if there is a concern about essentially if that methodology is not going to work, there is an approval to be able to cut, but that would be several feet below the surface. The pilings go down, I believe, more than 30 feet. So I don't know. Oh, hold on a sec. In the back? Yes, ma'am.
What's your experience been like working on this project? I mean, have you ever done anything like this before?
No. What's interesting though is that Siggy Finnis-Bogason, I got his name right. So he and I worked together. This is a complete tangent, but for those of you that are from around here, you might bring a smile to your. So when Hurricane Irma went through Florida, my first response was a field specialist taking pictures, doing photojournalism in Jacksonville for displaced boats, and there was a particular boat called the Swamp Fox. It was a shrimp boat, and it was a part of the derelict vessel program there, but it got displaced, so it got tagged for removal. Siggy was a part of the TNT team that removed that boat, and so we got to know each other over 10 days, disappeared for a couple years, and had a moment of looking at each other. So it was, oh, I'm sorry, the TNT is the salvage company that removed the vessel. So he's one of the salvage masters. And so there is a lot of, anytime a response like this happens, the salvage and the response community are, even though it's international, it's very small. And so people tend to see each other again. But I think the thing that struck me the most about this job is even the experts pause at every moment to consider, okay, when we do this, what could happen? And at any time, you know, having that secondary and tertiary effect, if they don't know, it's always proceed slowly with a lot of prudence and caution, safety first, and then once we know, based on, okay, we've done A, we're moving to B. If we learn something between A and B, we go back to the plan and we adapt it. We're not sitting there saying, well, we said it has to work this way. You know, most of the methodologies that were consistent throughout the wreck removal were not dictated by us. It was dictated by the environment. The location of the shipping channel, the challenge of the tidal cycle, you know, so finding a piece of equipment that could fit inside the barrier, inside our response footprint, all of those things that didn't change, it was really because they were essentially the perfect fit for the area. So much of the methodology changed when it came to advancing from cut to cut, from lift to lift, from removal to removal. For example, the Julie B departing with sections 3 and 5 when it was originally slated to depart with the bow and the next section in. So, that's one thing I learned, is that even when you've got a whole room of people that have dedicated their entire careers of doing this all across the world, they take a clean slate when they look at something like this. So yeah, you've got an interesting tidal environment around here. But that's the other thing that's impressed me the most is just how dynamic the ecosystem is. Being out with our shoreline teams, seeing our folks jump into the mud, putting out svags forward by hand, and you learn. And so just being with the salvage folks, you pick up their language and what they're looking for. A lot of our shoreline teams, these are coastal ecologists, geologists, marine biologists, and I'll ask questions and they'll give me like full paragraph answers. And so, it's been an incredible learning experience for me. I'm excited to see who I meet on the next response. I'm not excited for the next response because that, no one wants to see these things happen again. Yes.
What has been the safety record of this whole project?
So no major incidents, no major injuries. I believe we had one individual that there was a possibility for, I think, a broken arm, but after X-rays that didn't turn out. So some dings and some bumps, but when you consider the complexity of all of the stuff going on, the sheer size of the equipment. I mean, sure you've seen all the photos of just how big it's like a pulley system to lift something. It's not necessarily, it doesn't get more complex as it gets bigger. It just gets bigger and heavier. And, the slightest movement, it can, just bumping into something, hitting a piece of boom when you're out there working. So I believe it was Commander Lopez that quoted 3 million man hours spread across the entire response with no major injuries. That's huge. Now we're not done yet. So we're very much, and they reiterated that. Our safety officer told the team this morning in our morning brief, there's a lot of changes going on out there. There's a lot of, some people that are partying, some people that are coming in, and communication is the number one determinant of how safe an operation is going to be. And so always making sure that that everybody is very clear on how they're communicating and that there aren't any miscommunications, because miscommunications can lead to mishaps. So hopefully that answered your question.
Everybody's out of the bubble at
I don't, so as far as Epworth goes, I don't know the terms of that contract. There are still people at Epworth, but as far as the Tier 1 bubble goes, we still have our COVID policies and protocols that are in place for general public health. But as the main reason for sequestering at Epworth was to insulate our most critical workers that were charged with the cutting and the lifting and the removal operations for the wreck. That's why that facility was a game changer for us to get that level of sequestered lodging. Now that we're on the other side of the wreck removal, there's less need for it, but there's still a need to house people. So, they're continuing to work with Epworth just to make sure that the folks that need lodging have lodging. And that's a good question for Epworth. I don't have a clear answer on how long that contract's going to go for.
How many people are still actively working on the project?
That I don't know. It was about 125 to 150 when we were with the wreck removal. That number has drawn down considerably, or will be drawing down considerably, if we're talking about the Tier 1 folks. For the entire response, I believe we're still around 200, but that number will also be drawing down. Except for the shoreline teams, will still maintain their staff. Our on-water response team, with respect to debris recovery, will keep their posture going. Once the debris removal is done, you'll see another kind of step down in personnel.
With the shoreline, will that go 2 months after all the debris is out from
Yes, so you've asked about the shoreline inspection process, the 2-month inspection process. Some segments of the shoreline are going through that process right now because they are in areas that have not received any oil. Now, at any time during our surveys, if we find something, that opens the segment back up. So the inspection process is underway for certain areas. For others, basically at this point, the area of impact is essentially, if you think about where the ship is, any of the shoreline, if you were in the middle where the VB 10,000 is, and if you can see shoreline, that's all still areas where we're still actively monitoring. There's what they call passive attenuation. Basically, there's a natural breakdown process. So we're always looking to make sure that we're not going to further damage the environment by, I think what Todd Farrar, our SCAT coordinator, told me right before this meeting was, we're looking to reduce transferability for any existing oil or fresh oil. We're not seeing much fresh oil at all, other than some sheens that were out at the wreck site, but even those ended a couple days ago. So we're looking to reduce transferability. We're also looking for a point at which there's no further treatment required before you start to potentially impact the environment or the ecosystem there. A great example is some of the Johnson rocks that got oiled, right? So we remove as much as we can without removing the rocks. And so there is an environmental trade-off, but that's a part of that inspection process. And so there are other areas where, say, the southern end of Cumberland Island, where they're starting the inspection process on that, because even though we opened that up for debris, anytime we open up a segment, whether it's for debris or oil, we just keep it open. So they're looking at what segments can be inspected now, and then they are continuing to assess other segments that are closer, what we'd say, within the vicinity of the wreck site. I guess what I'm saying is our AOR is much larger than this particular area. The 200 miles of shoreline goes past the Lanier Bridge, up the McKay River, up to the top of Sea Island, and a little bit further north than that, all the way down to Cumberland Island. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
What is the environmental impact that this has caused? Do you have like any numbers, statistics, like
Right.
Wildlife?
Right. So what are the environmental impacts? So let me write this down. So I'm going to talk about oiled shoreline, and then I'm going to talk about shoreline, wildlife, because fortunately we've not seen any marine mammal impacts. So it's really, we're talking about oil on the shoreline and the marsh grass, and we're talking about oil wildlife. So as far as shoreline impacts, in fact, let me get my phone up here so I can speak to the latest and greatest. The thing about I'm remembering what my conversation with Jason Maddox, who is a former scientific support coordinator at NOAA, who now works for Gallagher. He's our planning section chief. And so when they're describing the oil, the first thing is that most of the volatile organic compounds, the gassing off, the lighter ends, I guess is an industry term for that came off very early on. And so the kind of discharges that we saw, that's essentially the thicker, lower, heavier oil that came out. And so that about 70% of that, when it hits the shoreline, can be recovered. So it's that other 30%, what happens. And it depends on the heat, depends on viscosity. And so some of the impacts that we saw along the shoreline, so for example, sand. I'll start with some of the most intense to the least intense. Most intense would have been oil that pooled up west of Wiley Street beach access. I believe, Maggie, I don't know if you were there for that, but I believe Sue and Fletcher was definitely there. And so he can confirm the condition of the area south of the golf course where there was a pool. That would represent the most extreme oil impact. And the difficulty with that, and when I was with our SCAT team, when they saw that, one of these gentlemen, his name is Tom Freeman, his first concern was when the next tide cycle comes in, this is going to move. And so the difficulty about treating shoreline impacts in a highly dynamic tidal environment is that oil floats, and so it travels. It means that you could have it pooled up here one day, and then it can spread out. And so sometimes you're chasing after the oil. The oil that was on the sand was removed mostly with hand tools, shovels, recovered in bags, and oil that was contacted riprap could go underneath that. And so the problem with accessing oil that goes underneath the riprap is, we're not going to destroy that, what's living in there. So we use a lot of sorbent material to remove oil from rocks. The choice was not to use hot washes or water. While it is a possible treatment, it was not recommended for this area because you're essentially splashing off oil into other parts of the environment. So it was really getting after it with sorbents, and then frankly using Sphagsorb to limit transferability. And the Sphagsorb is a coating. It's a fine powder that increases the surface area of the oil when it's tacky. When it's no longer tacky, the Sphagsorb doesn't really work. And so that's why if you probably saw when our shoreline teams are out in marsh grass or near rocks, you probably saw them throwing what looked like this brown dust all over everything. And that's to coat it while it's still sticky, because if we don't get to it with Sphagsorb, there could be marsh rack that can mix in with it, peat can mix in with that. That's good for limiting transferability, but we'd prefer to be able to set up passive systems behind that at that same location. So I'm all talking about that area west of Wiley Street. Well, I think we called it segment St.Simons Island 9. So it's two segments. So it's 1,000 meters from Wiley Street west. And the treatments that we used, Sphagsorb, sorbents, actively used, and then, oh, that's right, so passively. So they described them as like shark fins. So they put out stakes, and they line the stakes with sorbent material. So as the tide comes in, it goes through that, and then if it comes, any oil that lifts and floats comes back out, it gets caught by that. Essentially, we're creating a net for oil out of sorbents. It helps reduce the amount. It does not eliminate all the oil. That's the hardest part. That's the trade-off, is that you get to this point to where hopefully the affected area is when you're making an environmental assessment, just inside a response. We're not talking about a damage assessment, which is not what the response managers are charged with, because frankly it's a conflict of interest. That's where you have your other agencies that have oversight over this response process, and they will look at that once we're done. So when we're inside the response box, we're looking at how can we get this area to where there's no treatment needed, so that transferability to wildlife is not an issue, and that the concentration is not an issue where you create mats. Todd Farrar, I've been referencing his name a lot. I just want to make sure that when I'm saying something, I'm also going to quote the person who said it to me, so that you don't think it's like coming from me in my brain. Right? So Todd says that oil is dangerous when it's in its higher concentrations. As it starts to move out, as it gets less and less and less, it eventually becomes a part of the carbon cycle. But that can be depending on how what the oil contacts and what concentration it's in. That can be a short amount of time, or it could be a very long amount of time. What he did tell me is that what makes this environment unique is that the tide cycles are so intense, and that the turbidity, there's a lot of sediment that's just in the water column here, it beats the hell out of oil. And it gets it down to what we call a natural attenuation. And that's a term that's used in a lot of NOAA materials about coastal restoration. And so you're seeing a natural attenuation of oil impacts on a shoreline that has been previously impacted. There are no new impacts that we're seeing. There's no fresh oil that we're finding in, quantities that, for the last 8 weeks of our Shoreline team reports, it's been no oil observed on certain segments, no fresh oil. The SRBs, there was a while where we were getting these globules where it was like it was jelly, and if you were on I think halfway down the shoreline on Jekyll Island, we had some long strips of what was like these fresh globules of oil, which are really sticky. We've not seen those in quite a while, and so the site tells us a story because that's where the source of these could be. The other challenging part about shoreline impacts is that a particular area that has a heavy barrier, and when we have the current busters out there, the current busters are designed to collect oil. They were also great places for birds to fish for bait. And so as soon as it was clear for us to be able to remove those current busters, and that was once the engine room was gone. Now granted, we did see some significant discharges with Section 6. There was a problematic tank that was with that, and it was a part of our estimates. But the decision was made after the engine room was removed to, instead of having the current busters fixed, to have them rove around and towed. While that does make it more challenging for collecting oil at the apexes, what it did is it reduced the potential for prolonged wildlife impacts at those apexes. So we did Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research, worked with our natural resource advisors to identify any oiled wildlife, or frankly wildlife where what they were looking for was mostly birds that were showing signs of it starts to look sick, like it's and when I was talking with Tim Kais of the Wildlife Resources division here of DNR, he's your local bird expert. I mean, Tim is an amazing amount of knowledge about not just local bird populations, but migrating bird populations. He says the number one cause of death for just birds at large around here is emaciation. It's just not being able to get food. And so what we were seeing is that, at certain points you'd see like a pelican that the NRAs were looking at, and they were going to look for that one, watch that one, and it was easier, I would say, out at the barrier because it was a common roosting point, and so you'd have the same. They would get to know the birds. They'd be like, okay, that's that one, and as they got thicker, they wouldn't move. And so at a certain point, if capture could be attempted where it wouldn't injure the bird, they would attempt to recover. And so we did rehabilitate several birds. Don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but we made captures and rehabilitations at the protection barrier. We also recovered several pelican carcasses inside the protection barrier. What's difficult about that is that just like we saw oil float out of the barrier, things can float into the barrier. So any carcasses that we recovered, while the cause of death is extremely difficult to determine, all of those carcasses were taken to the Coastal Resources Division for their further analysis. At this time, they've not performed any autopsies, simply because the emaciation, they were able to determine how the bird died. The impacts that we saw at Bird Island are significant simply because it was the way that the royal tern chicks, these are fledgling royal terns, it was perplexing to our teams of how they got oil. Because usually when you see oil impacted wildlife, they're in an area where you can also see impacted shoreline. The challenge with the oil impacts with the royal tern chicks at Bird Island was that we could confirm the oiled chicks, but we did not see any oil impacted shoreline. So essentially what we did over a series of days is we just observed their behavior And what we think, this is not confirmed, this is not a science, it was a scientifically rigorous observation. It was just kind of like, okay, we've seen them do this behavior a couple of times, maybe that's how they got oiled, was that some of the chicks that are a little bit more daring went out onto the rocks. Usually they're on the backside of Bird Island where there's sand, and that's a fun fact about royal terns, they don't hunt for themselves. The adults communally feed their chicks. And so if a chick gets too far from kind of where everybody gets fed, it will it could succumb to just lack of nutrition. But so some of these chicks, what we think is they went out at a time where the tide was shifting and a stream of oil was present, and they got oiled. But because of how the tide was moving, it's possible that the oil floated by and didn't actually deposit on the rocks. Because while Tim was looking at, I walked with Tim doing a bird survey, our shoreline folks were going around and they were looking all over the place for where's the oil, looking at blades of glass, see if they could get some kind of pointer. So it was perplexing to us. What we did as a result is we arranged what we call tattletale boom. It's essentially the white sorbent boom that you might have seen that we've used extensively inside the barrier, and some of the orange boom that's around when it was out. For example, Joiner Creek and inside the boom area in Bird Island, it's the sorbent boom, which is hydrophobic, meaning that it won't suck up water, but it will suck up oil. They place it out there so that it's like a passive monitoring system. If oil is on the surface and it comes by overnight, in the morning we get some kind of evidence of that. The tattletale boom that they put up after we observed the oiling chick incident, to that point didn't reveal any. Basically, it didn't happen again. Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research was able to recover 20 oiled royal tern chicks. 10 of them made it through rehab, and those were released. You can see videos of those releases on the website, as well as several laughing gulls were released and several pelicans were released. Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research, they have several facilities along the East Coast. They're out of Newark, Delaware, but their primary base of operation for rehabilitation was a raptor center in South Carolina. So it was about a four-hour drive. So they would make the recovery and very quickly get the patient to the raptor center in South Carolina. Roughly, the chicks only took a couple days. Some of the adult birds took a week. And the reason is that the chicks don't have the weatherproofing like an adult bird has, and so the chicks went through the rehab process faster because they didn't need the time to basically preen themselves back into having weatherproofing. That also makes them incredibly sensitive, and so anytime that you're rehabilitating a wild animal, the time is ticking. So yes, we've had wildlife impacts, and I can speak firsthand that when we could not do any harm, right? A flighted oiled bird is, we simply watch it, but we're not gonna, much like the ecosystems of the shoreline, we're not trying to do more injury to it's a wild animal, right? It doesn't want to be captured. But the ones that we could, our specialists did to the full extent of their resources, what they could to rehabilitate those animals, and we did successfully release many.
Tell us about your dreams.
Oh, so, yes,
were
question.
there any penalties ever assessed against the shipping company or somebody?
I don't know. If that happens, it would be determined by agencies outside the response. Yes.
What has been the cost of this operation?
So I know that number for the state and federal resources, so that's about $20 million, but that's like, that's not the number that y'all want to hear, right? It's so there's an article that was published in Tradewinds magazine.
I don't know if it's magazine. Anyway, they interviewed the global claims officer for the insurer and the responsible party, and so I would point to that article. I believe $842 million was the number that was quoted in that article, and they said it was basically half and half on the wreck removal, half on the environmental resources used. And the difference is that, once again, I'm quoting this article, that the wreck removal cost was fixed because it's a contracted process with the salver. The environmental response numbers were dynamic. It really depended on what was needed. So, for example, when we had those discharges in removing Section 6, we just knew that we had their full support and their full resource so that we could reach into work pools and get people out onto the shoreline to remove what we were seeing. We weren't necessarily thinking about how much it was going to cost, because that's not the, at least on our level, that's not what we're thinking about.
Where did the absorbent booms go that have the oil in them? Where were they transported to? The local landfills, like in Charlton County and.
So the final, I don't know the answer to the final. I can tell you as far as I know. So the absorbent booms that were used on a lot of the outriggers that you saw when we deployed them out on the water, that boom goes, as soon as it's spent, it goes right into a plastic bag. Those plastic bags went into a Connex container that was on a barge that we called our mini decon site that was floating outside the EPB. And then those containers, once they were full, they were discharged through hazardous waste streams that are pre-approved. But I don't know exactly, like, the Connex container, like, where it's a contracted facility that then processes that material. So it's not going into a landfill.
We're interested in that.
Okay, I will write that down. Yes.
I just know we have about 10, 15 more minutes, so I know that we could probably go for 2 more hours asking you questions.
Right.
Yeah, so we'll let Himes
Like,
rest his
take a
voice
break.
for a minute. Yeah, and if you still have some questions
write
at
that
the end, we can. But I'm going to speak just a little bit to some of what he's pointed out about the areas that have been most heavily oiled and some of the concerns and overall environmental concerns. And so Altamaha Riverkeeper's function, like I mentioned at the beginning, is to be a watchdog organization and push for the utmost environmental protections that we can get, right? And so on the handout that I've just given you is a description of what a natural resource damages assessment is. And so we are doing all that we can to push for the state to officially initiate the NRDA, Natural Resource Damage Assessment. So that is a process where natural resource trustees, so experts like the subject matter experts that Himes has referred to, who've been on the response team, but people who are not on the response team, come in and evaluate the full extent of the damages and injuries to the environment. And Altamaha Riverkeeper believes that that is the best tool for us to know for certain how badly injured our coastal resources have been by the Golden Ray incident. The pictures that are at the bottom, that's from the last major oiling event on Wiley, like you mentioned, where there were standing pools of oil. Just in the past couple of weeks, if you walk that beach down there at low tide, you probably think, oh, it looks clean. But if you know what you're looking for, you can still see evidence of oil down there. If you scoop up some mud and sand, it smells like bunker fuel. If you step in it and make a puddle, there'll be a sheen where your foot was. Okay? So some of that, like he was saying, like, they're limited on what they can actually do to remove that without causing more environmental harm, right? And we understand that, but we also want there to be a full assessment of what the presence of oil in our marsh means for the long-term health of our marsh ecosystem. And this map, all the area in red there is the shoreline and marsh around St. Simons Sound. This is a NOAA map that indicates the areas most vulnerable to injury from oil. That's pretty much all of our environment down here that has been sitting next to the Golden Ray for the past 2 years. Okay, so what you can do, on the other side at the bottom is a link, or you can just go find our Facebook page or go to altamahariverkeeper.org, and there's already one of those, here's the letter, put in your information, click send, to encourage our state officials to initiate a NERDA. Only certain entities can initiate a NERDA. So NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they could come in as a federal entity to do it, or Georgia DNR has to do it, or Governor Kemp has to tell somebody to do it. So if you've got connections, use them. Okay?
Why would they not want to do it?
Great question.
I don't have an answer for that.
I don't answer that. Okay.
I think this woman does.
I don't have an answer to why they wouldn't want to do it either. So any more questions for me, or last questions for Mr. Himes?
Has there been resistance to it?
So from what has been explained to me, typically a natural resources damage assessment is determined after a response is done. It's kind of, if you think about it, it's like it's an investigation. So, they let us do our work, and then you have the agencies come in and review that work. So, depending on when you start that assessment process, we're still in an active response here. So, those agencies will make that determination once response activities have concluded. That means the end of the months-long inspection process of all the shoreline. So yeah, I don't have really any more information on the damage assessment process other than what the state on-scene coordinator said, which is the Georgia EPD is viewing this part of the response as a pre-natural resources damage assessment phase.
So they do have a pre-assessment phase to determine, they are required, natural resource trustees are required to do a pre-assessment, and then it's like optional based on that whether they actually choose to initiate a NERDA. And that's the response that we've been given, is that they'll make the decision once it's fully over. There is precedent from other events, other natural resource damage assessments throughout the years of being initiated as soon as an incident happens. And there's precedent that it doesn't get initiated for years after an incident has occurred. So, there's precedent for both.
The danger is this goes away, and interest in it goes away,
Granted, I'll play both sides of I have been told by some of the NERDA experts that there can also be a risk at starting one too soon. Because they start it too soon, they make their decision that there's been no injury, and then the injury isn't seen because, like I said, that oil that's entrained in our marsh could not cause die-off for a long time to come, potentially. Not saying that it's going to happen, that's total hypothetical. But there are just some times in these incidents where you don't see the injury right away. It takes some time for the injury to become evident to however it can be assessed. So, there is some argument for what is the right timing, but we don't want it to just quietly get forgotten. So that's why we are being very vocal about it. Yeah. Right.
I can speak on behalf of the Coast Guard Marine Safety Unit, Savannah. This is their AOR, so anytime a call is logged to the National Response Center, the best way to keep visibility on a case is to, when you see something, say something, and you've got that response line. That creates a documentation process that MSU Savannah has a copy of that NRC report, as does the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Environmental Protection Division. So I believe there's been some other concerns about the port facility, and you know those reporting lines are there for the community. So we encourage you to use them. Do you see that?
Right. Before anybody else leaves, if you have a red star or red smiley face on your handout that you got, you get a door prize. If you still have any questions, we'll certainly stick around and take them. And I don't know if you want any Altamaha Riverkeeper swag, but here's a.
You might need it for all that water he's gonna need after.
Well, I'm thinking more about, like, that's another thing I got to put into a bag, and when I, my backpack. But I will gladly offer that up as a door prize.
You can have one if you would like. So if you have a red star or red smiley face and you would like, and you can help me mine.